All right. Hey, everyone, and welcome to another Friday live stream for the Nonprofit Launchpad Group. I am your host, Dan Johnson. And if you're not already getting these streams on a regular basis, join the Nonprofit Launchpad on Facebook. We do Monday resource drop. We'll drop in cool worksheets or tools for you to grow your nonprofit. We do Wednesday AMA, so you can ask me anything about growing and launching your new nonprofit. And of course, we do our Friday live streams with a expert who can help nonprofits. And if you have any questions or comments throughout the stream, just go ahead and drop them into the comment section. I'll see them and I will light them up on screen like that. All right. Today, I have one of my good friends and mentors for a long time, Joe Firamonte. He found me when I was like 18 and just launched my first website. But actually, Joe, why don't you tell the experience from your side, how you ran into me?
Sure. Yeah. So been doing the branding thing for a while at that point, and just couldn't articulate why, but every year we try to pick up some nonprofit work. And we do it pro bono. Something I'm passionate about is just giving back. And that year, NDAA just got the booster shot at midnight New Year's Eve, essentially. And it was something I was concerned about and serious about. And so I reached out to a few organizations that popped up rather quickly to try and fight that piece of legislation. And Dan was the only one that got back to me. And so you were 18 years old. You looked like you were maybe 10, maybe.
I did not have this at the
No.
time.
And I think we just, I saw some pictures online, so I didn't expect much. But I think the first time we jumped on a web chat was almost a year later. And I was like, man, oh man, this kid looks like he's 12 years old tops. But yeah, we did some branding and messaging for you, and did the website, helped you get organized a little bit, and that took off fast. And it was fun because we kind of intentionally made it look not as polished as my typical client work, because we knew if it looked too polished, it would send the wrong message and wouldn't look appropriate for who and what you were and what the organization was. And then I don't know if it was a year or 2 years later, it graduated, right? You started making connections with senators and Congress critters and other politicians, governors and whatnot. And so it had to be less grassroots looking, more formal, more professional. Whereas initially we would have scared the grassroots movement by looking like we're too well funded for this, something's up.
Yeah.
And now we had to look well funded. And so we rebranded again and looked, much more, professional, for lack of a better word. And that was successful. So yeah, it was a fun project.
Well, and one thing I loved about it was just very grunge when you first created it.
Yeah.
Like it took, if you've ever seen the presidential seal, it was like the presidential seal, but sort of like it was thrown onto a wall.
Right.
And it really did. It got across the message that we did have a brand, but it was grassroots. And
Yeah.
we got the branding was the best thing about Panda, because we had like $3,000 in the bank per year, and we had just like an incredible um, groundswell of people who liked us because of our brand. And it's something like when I wrote an article recently on the Next Level Nonprofits blog, and that article is about what it actually costs to start a nonprofit in 2023. So we go through, like most people when they're starting a nonprofit, they don't know what are you actually supposed to pay for. And so we go through and outline all of them. And the one that sticks out in like how much money we advise you to spend on it is branding.
Mm-hmm.
Rest of it, whatever, get yourself a free email client, get yourself free this, free that. Yeah. Branding and coaching. Those are the two things that you really need to invest money in. And I think that the brand that we had was a huge part of our success, getting 300,000 some odd people to visit
absolutely.
our website in 1 year. So let's talk a little bit about you and how did you get into brand development? First of all.
Yeah. So, I my undergrad experience, I was a fine art major. I tell people I studied to be a starving artist, and then I lived the dream. I was literally homeless for a while, doing art out in California and music and, silly stuff. And went back, got a teaching degree. And in New York State, where I was teaching, you need to get a master's degree in order to keep that teaching license in New York State. And so I went back for graphic design. I taught myself all the software. I was doing some websites and stuff. But I didn't, at a low level, I could make stuff, but I didn't have a lot of understanding about why things looked the way they looked in application to that. And I was a little bitter about my art school experience. And then when I got to graduate school and I looked at my peers' work and heard them talk about it, I realized like, oh, all that theory stuff and all that really kind of heady stuff I didn't take, I was kind of bitter about, felt like it was a waste, suddenly had application. Because in art school you learn about why people respond the way they do, why things mean what they mean, why do symbols and aesthetics and colors affect people on a really deep emotional level. And when you realize that people are primarily emotional creatures, that I think most experts in psychology would agree that logic is kind of the PR center of the brain. It's how we justify the thing that we did. It's not the driving factor for what we did. And you begin to realize that, and you begin to be a little bit more intentional, even maybe, it sounds even a little nefarious, but like if you're making design work, if you're writing body copy and messaging for a company, you're trying to persuade people. I mean, at the end of the day, we're trying to get them to do something, whether that's make a purchase, vote a certain way, come out to an event, whatever it is. And, there's an art and a craft and a skill to doing that. And SCAD, I went to the Savannah College of Art and Design and learned how to apply all that kind of theoretical stuff to, more commercial practices. And so I learned a lot at SCAD. That was a great experience. I started working for several kind of big companies through that network of people at SCAD. One was JCB. They make construction equipment. I learned a lot at that experience. Started reading everything I could get my hands on. I've always been kind of an avid reader. I kind of just turned my TV off when I went to undergraduate school, as a freshman in college. I just started reading as much as I could, especially nonfiction. And so when I got into my branding class at SCAD, read all the stuff for class and then read all the cited resources on that and got very deep into the psychology of it. I'm not a psychologist. I don't claim to be, but I read as much as I can and understand as much as I can because it's very, very applicable to what I do. And that's helped a lot. So that's the short version. And
So
now it just snowballed. I got clients and projects and kind of built a reputation.
and then you met me, who
Yeah.
regularly demands stuff from you in 24 to 48 hours.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit. If I say, hey, branding is the number one thing that you should be spending money on as a new nonprofit. Let's talk a little bit about what is a brand, because the vast majority of people confuse marketing and branding. They don't really understand what a brand is. Like they know of like logos that make them happy, or colors that they like, and that's how they go into the branding process. So can you talk a little bit about what exactly we're talking about here? What is a brand? What is branding?
Yeah, and there's so many books written about this. There's so many companies calling themselves branding agencies that do what I would call logo design or just graphic design. I think there's a big difference, and I don't think that the term is really well defined. But what it means to me is it's kind of a triadic model. Your brand is the combination of the character of your organization. What are the values that the people who make up your company have in common? What do they hold? What is the experience that you deliver through a product or through a service? When somebody outside the organization approaches and interacts with that entity, that company, what do they experience? What are their feelings about that? And then
So
the
like
third
if
part,
I'm, as an example, if I'm a food bank, for example, then part of my brand is not just my logo and my colors, but when a client comes to the food bank and gets food from us,
right?
how does that experience make them feel?
Right. And so that's the third component, is the expectation setting. And that's what I mean when I say branding. It's not the brand, but how do we set expectations so that the experience somebody has when they interact with the organization is what they expected. It's what they came here for. and was it a good experience, right? Because if I'm going to a food bank and the expectation is set that I'm going to get a certain type of food, that it was vegan or something like that, and that's not what I get, then I'm kind of like, wait a minute, that's not what I came here for. Or maybe a restaurant is a better example. If I go to a restaurant and all the branding and messaging screams to me, this is a vegan restaurant, and I get in there and all they have is hamburgers, something's terribly, terribly wrong, right? And that's kind of a ludicrous, over the top, extreme example, but that's what we're talking about here when we're talking about branding. It's my job as the expectation setter, as the branding consultant, is okay, I need to really get to know this company or this organization. What do they do? How do they do it? What will people get when they interact with this company or this organization? And then how do I connect those two parts in a meaningful way so that people aren't confused? They're not walking in and getting something they never dreamed they were signing up for, and they have a really positive experience when they do that.
So, how do you go about figuring out A, I guess, why are they important? And then B, how do you go about figuring out what your values are as a
Mhm.
organization? Because you could go ask everybody and they'll be, well, these are my values and these are mine and these are yours, and they don't all
Yeah.
quite match up. So how do you go about that process of figuring out what your values are?
Yeah, it's a pretty lengthy process to do it right. And it's, the design component and the copywriting component, they come last. You have to really do some diligence and understand what's important to the organization and help them understand what's important to the people that they serve and find where those things connect. And so we start with a company wide survey, or at least the leadership. We ask them to complete a pretty lengthy form, and it's always fascinating to me because these are such basic things. We've started calling it our square one exercise, and we will ask the CEO, the CFO, the COO, all the C-suite people to fill out this document and just answer some simple questions and tell us, why was this company started? How was it started? Who are the people you serve? What do they get out of this relationship? What are they saying about you when it's over? Who are you trying to connect? Really fundamental business questions that you would think everybody had the same crystal clear answer on, and everybody's got a wildly different perspective on what the company does. The people
Mm.
who are making the product, we do a lot of technology companies and a lot of SaaS products, just software as a service products. The people building these applications have a wildly different perspective and understanding than the CEO has, and both of them have a wildly different understanding than the marketing team does. And the marketing team is driving all of these people to the company, and then the salespeople are in the mix, and they're trying to sell this thing with a certain set of expectations. And if they don't agree, there's a whole lot of confusion, frustration, and aggravation, not only between the team members, but the people who are coming in the door. And so we start
So
there. We just ask these questions and we get them all in a room. And they're like, oh, well, I had no idea everybody thought so differently. And we start to, from there, drill down on, okay, we need to agree on this. These are all the perspectives. Let's hash it out and figure out what are the real answers that we all agree on. And from there, then you can start to think about, how do we talk about it so that all the people outside the organization are being told this is what we're about. So when you come here, this is what you're going to get.
So, what about for a sole founder?
Mhm.
One of the things we work on with organizations is North Star, mission, vision, values.
Mhm.
We do that first,
Yeah.
and we look at okay, what the way I describe values, and I'd love it if you have a better way. The way I describe values is your vision is where you're going, your mission is how you plan to get there, your values are how you plan to treat people along the way.
Say
Um,
that last part again.
your values are how you plan to treat people along the way,
Right.
essentially. And love a better way to do that. But for if you're a sole founder, how do you figure out, especially separating your personal values from the values of the company? How do you do that well at the beginning?
Yeah. So I think the challenge that a sole founder would have, and I think the problem a lot of organizations have too, is that they think they can have a lot of values, right? And it's maybe fashionable even to have a list of core values, plural, and you'll list these three, four, five things. And that's okay as long as they're centered, they're built around a single core value. We're very simple creatures that want clarity, and we have a hard time agreeing, just on one thing, let alone four things. So if you're setting up a set of four or five or six, seven core values that aren't centered around one core thing, and it should be very emotional, um, then you're creating confusion, and you're also creating discord, because you're going to have a hard enough time getting people to agree on one thing. Forget about getting them to agree about seven things. That's just not going to happen.
Mm.
It's useful to talk about big brands because people are familiar with them, but I think the rules of human psychology, the human experience, apply. So, the easy one is a big brand like McDonald's, because everybody's familiar with it. They're not selling indigestion. They're not selling. Forgive me. Let me put this on mute.
Good.
They're not selling hamburgers or toys. They're selling happiness. That's their core value, their core proposition. And everything they talk about centers around that. The Happy Meal. They have the Play Center for kids. I mean, they're literally trying to get children to imprint this notion of big up concept, right? Happiness with their
Mm.
food. Their food is literally engineered for the maximum dopamine hit when you eat it. And so all of their messaging, all their commercials for decades, it's consistently about happiness. I'm loving it. These kinds of things, because it's simple, it's easy. And if they can condition me to think about their food and happiness, I'm going to go there if I'm not feeling too happy, and that'll perk me up. Right. Apple is
Sure.
another good one. People think they sell computers and phones and this and that. They're not. They're selling rebellion, and it's encapsulated in their logo. It's the very first rebellion. The Western notion of the fall and Adam and Eve, and
Mm.
that's deeply associated with knowledge. It wasn't an apple tree; it was the tree of knowledge. And so these are very deeply ingrained in the collective unconsciousness of Western civilization, and they have tapped into that really well. If you think about their first big campaign, it was think different, little acts of rebellion, think different. And they had just curated photos of celebrities. I don't even know what the process of getting rights for these were, but people like Amelia Earhart, people like John Lennon, uh, Muhammad Ali, people who did things different. And they said, think different. They paired it with these rebel characters in our society that everybody's familiar with. And, move forward. They had the Mac PC commercials with Justin Long, kind of the nerdy guy in the suit who looked like Bill Gates, almost. And he was just clumsy goofball. And then Justin Long was just kind of chill, and untucked, a little bit of scruff. He was a little bit of a
Hmm.
rebel, just a little. Right. And so, we all buy the same gizmos and have all the same products, and it's monoculture, but we all think we're thinking different because we use Apple. Right.
Mm.
So smaller organizations and companies within their world, within the realm of nonprofits in this case, they can be known for one core thing. And that's hard to get to. And I think for anybody who's not trained in this stuff, doesn't think about it often, they don't even know that's what they're trying to do. And they might change what they're trying to do and what that core value is with every campaign that they run, every speech that they give. And all those speeches and campaigns can be different, but they should be different ways of appealing to the same value. What are people coming here for? What can we build community around? What is this one thing we all agree on? And that's when you get a pretty good following and a loyalty that lasts years, because people know what
So
they're getting.
so let me toss an example out there.
Sure.
So let's say that you have a nonprofit that I don't know. Let's say we'll use one of my existing clients as an example. You run a network of foster care homes for
Mhm.
people who are in crisis so that they can take their pet and give it to you. They can't afford boarding school, but they need to go to the ER, or they need to go to the doctor or something like that, or they're having a divorce, something where they're in crisis, they need to hand off their animal.
Mhm.
So you're the organization that operates this vast foster network of foster families for the animal and take care of it for about a week, and then
Mhm.
you give it back to that person. What is the feeling that you're trying to put out there as a organization, or what could some of them be as an example?
Yeah, and it's often surprising. Like I can make certain assumptions based on my experience and my knowledge of this subject matter, but when you actually get in and start to talk to people and ask a lot of questions about how they feel and why, you're often surprised by the answer. So I'm going to go off assumptions, but it's important to note, like, you have to do the legwork in order to get the real answer. But it seems like it would be some kind of a caregiver motif, that I want to either want to be viewed as compassionate, or
Mm,
I want to be socially minded, animal minded, something, something to do with caring for animals, that I'm known for being this compassionate person. So compassion might be a really good core value.
mm.
Um, it could be, I don't know, help me out. I mean, you've been working with them. So what are some other things people say about it?
Yeah, I think that maybe reliability could
Yeah,
be a
dependable
core
is a big one.
value
Mhm.
because another example, there's a food rescue organization that I work with that the reason that that grocery stores and businesses, they work with over 100 restaurants and grocery stores in the South Florida area. The reason that grocery stores and businesses work with them
Mhm.
is because they always pick up the food. It's not just, somebody
Right.
says they're gonna come pick up the donated food and then they don't. They always pick up the food. So when other organizations drop that and they're
Yeah,
not reliable, they're always there. They're
that's a
always there
great
to pick
one.
up the
Yeah,
food.
that's a great example too, because if you're in a space where everybody's emoting that they're very compassionate, but they don't have their act together, and you can say, we're not only we're compassionate, sure, but you can depend on us. That's a much stronger message in that space. So that's how
Mm,
you get to that one thing that people know you for. And I think, the net promoter score angle on it too, like, you can always imagine, what do you want other people to say about you? Maybe that's a good way for founders to think about this. The first thing that comes out of their mouth, what do you want them to say about you? And if it's, we're reliable, that's your core value as a sole founder.
mm.
um, because you don't want that to be different every single time. You want that to be the first thing out of people's mouth. That's a good way to kind of gut check and figure out what's important to you.
Interesting. That is it's the very first thing that people say, or that someone would say about you, that you want someone to
Hmm.
say about you. Now, can your core value change over time? So, like, let's say you go into an industry where compassion is pretty lacking, but over a couple of years, you find out that what they really need is reliability. It's
Hmm.
compassion. You've taken care of that. Now, there's several other organizations who see the same opportunity and they're going after it. But then you realize there's this reliability gap that's there. Does that change your core value of compassion, or does it add a secondary value, or how does that work?
Yeah, I don't think companies and organizations should probably ever change their core value.
Mm,
If you don't know what it is, or you have some kind of an epiphany that, oh my gosh, I've been wrong for years, then yeah, you haven't really changed it though. You've just changed the way that you think about it. But
mm,
again, the big brands are helpful because people are familiar with them. Apple's been selling Rebellion for well over 40, 50 years very effectively. Um, McDonald's has been selling happiness. Coca-Cola's been selling happiness for, over a century. They haven't changed that. And if you look back at their history, some of their major marketing flaws and like big mistakes is when they forgot that for a moment and they had to reel it in. So New Coke, for example, right? Coke is a very nostalgic brand. It's an innocent brand. We look back to the good old days, and they did something new, and it failed epically because it was so off from their core values of nostalgia and looking back on the good old days and happiness in that regard. So
mm.
it's not only happiness, it's like a very specific kind of happiness, a nostalgic one. And so I think, yeah, with any organization, once you know what that core thing is, you don't want to change that, because you're creating something different. And all the people that follow you up to this point, they're not going to follow you anymore, because you're asking all of them to not only change their values, but you're asking to change the way that they think of you and the way they have been thinking about you for a very long time. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have campaigns and other things, but I try to stick with that core value and figure out, can we build these new things around it in a meaningful way that doesn't change it? And very often you can. And then sometimes, like New Coke, there's no way to spin that, right? You can't take the
Yeah.
new thing and look at it like the good old days, and they learned that the hard way. So it's I think the North Star is a great way to talk about it. It doesn't move, and these
Right.
other things spinning around it, they do move, but you don't want to try to move the North Star. The whole world's got a lot of problems when you move the North Star.
That's true. Our GPSs all give up all at once.
Yeah,
You move the North Star.
that's the least of our
Um,
problems.
no, that makes a lot of sense. So, if I'm starting from scratch and looking to develop a brand for my nonprofit, a lot of nonprofit leaders, they don't have anything resources wise to actually put together and develop a brand. So if I'm starting from scratch, where do I start when I'm going to develop a brand?
Yeah, I think getting
Because most people start with the logo, honestly. Like they just jump right to the
yeah, which
logo and
is
create a
a
logo.
big mistake. Big mistake, right? I mean, things look the way they do for a reason. And if you don't know what that reason is, you're kind of shooting in the dark. So, I mean, the brand should really start with understanding what your core value proposition is. What's your company all about? Um, and the leadership, whoever that is. If it's one person, write this out, journal about this. And I would come back to just what do you want the first thing people say about you to be? I think that's a really good way to think about it if you're just doing this on your own. But if you have a board or you have a couple co-founders or something like that, you got to get in the room and agree on some core fundamentals. And I can give you a link to a document we use. It's written more for technology businesses, not really nonprofits, but it might be helpful to people. And you can kind of tweak the questions as you're going through it to fit your business model. But yeah, just agreeing on why is the company here? What do we do? Who do we serve? What do they get out of it? And again, what do you want the first thing they say about you to be? And making sure that you always agree on that. Something we're working on at Dark Square right now is how do we're really good at establishing that stuff, but we found like as time goes on, some companies do a great job of kind of enshrining those values and making sure that everybody in the organization knows those and that new people coming in leadership positions are, they agree with these as they're coming in. Other companies, they get a new CMO, VP, whatever, the new person comes in and they don't know all that stuff. They don't get told this stuff or they just don't care. And then things start to break down and they're having problems after these new people come in. So that's something we're working on is how do we kind of enshrine these things in an organization so that they live and continue to inform every aspect of the business.
Well, I think one question, once you have your core values down,
Mhm.
is well, what does that look like when I'm reaching different audiences? Right. So in nonprofits, this is a particular problem because nonprofits do not receive any resources from the people that they are serving almost always. And so, do you design your brand around the people you're serving, or do you design it around what the donors are actually looking for? Or is it some
Mhm.
combination of the two that you're trying to do? How do you answer that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's the really fun, challenging part of when you establish what the values of the organization are, what the experience they provide is, how do you now go and articulate that to a bunch of different people and get people who maybe even normally wouldn't agree on things to agree on things? Um, two examples come to mind. I think we'll go with the latter. So we did some branding for a gentleman named Michael Heiser. He's a biblical scholar. And so he just was a prolific writer and he had a lot of interesting audiences that didn't make much sense. He had very academic, scholarly, peer-reviewed audience. He was going to universities and conferences where people who have devoted their lives to studying biblical text and related texts, not even necessarily Christian. A lot of these are just scholars who are atheists who are just deep in the academic research and that world. And so he also had your average Sunday churchgoer who is not super. They don't have 3 PhDs in ancient languages. So talking to that person who's interested in the subject matters, they're worlds apart in so many ways. In fact, just the fact that the Sunday churchgoer is by default a believer, and the hardcore academic who knows so much more about this text than that person does is very often not a believer, is like worlds apart. And then for whatever reason, because he writes about the Old Testament, and the History Channel Ancient Aliens crowd was really interested in some of the weird stuff in the Old Testament, and they believe all kinds of stuff that has nothing to do with either of those camps. And so you have all these really
Sure.
passionate nerds that have nothing to do with each other except the subject matter. And
Yeah.
so figuring out how to talk about it so that they can all agree on Michael Heiser as a core value proposition was a lot of fun. And then really interesting conversations start to happen, and you start to develop community around people who don't necessarily agree on much, but they agree on this. And so
Mm.
it should be consistent. You might adjust it a little bit for one lane or the other when you're talking specifically to one crowd or another, but the message is still the same part of it. You know, it was just an intellectual honesty that Mike had, where he was so uniquely able to talk about stuff that he knew more than just about anybody on planet Earth about in such a humble, approachable way, that he was able to, get all these people to, get along. We did another project, unintentionally, another church project where it was a similar problem. It helped inner city churches just get their services organized and functional. And so their donors were very much people who lived in suburbia and drank Starbucks coffee, and the people they served were inner city people who may be even homeless. And so again, worlds apart, but what did they agree on? Well, it was the Christian faith and Christ. And how do we talk about it in a way? And it's so sad to me that this has been politicized and weaponized, that something like Christianity could be used to be divisive, and they were trying so hard to make it not divisive. And it was a challenge, right? Because those two groups of people, there's a power dynamic there, there's a disparity dynamic there. But how do you get people who live very comfortable lives, want to give money to this thing in a way that's not kind of condescending and not, oh, let me help you? It was like, no, we're all believers here. We're all equal in the eyes of God. And, I'm just because I happen to have money, it doesn't make me better or smarter or anything better than you, and it was a really refreshing project to work on, because the leadership was able to have these very uncomfortable conversations about race dynamics and things like that. And we could just talk about, all right, how do we be very sensitive to both camps so that we're not offending or hurting anybody, and we're building community around this idea where we can bring very, very different people together who have very sensitive power dynamics, disparity, all these, a lot of really uncomfortable stuff, and get them to agree and come together and build friendships and build family around that. It was a lot of fun to work on that.
That's interesting. So you kind of take all of the audiences that
Mhm.
are going to need to be a part of this, and you're like, well, what is you now? You'd probably more or less decide your core value first, and
Mhm.
then you go look at the audiences and see how you message that to each audience. Because like, there's the core value, particularly for a nonprofit, is this is what you want to bring to the world.
Yeah.
And it's very related to like your vision statement. And then after that, you're like, okay, we've got all these audiences. How do we message this to donors? How do we message this to clients? How do we message this to that
Yeah,
kind of?
that's part of it. And very often, like once you've established in a vague sense, this is the core value. Like let's use Coke again because there's nuance to it, right? Or we could look at the. I'm not going to pull another example, and it's a good one we already know. What kind of happiness is it might come out as you talk to different parties, right? Because happiness to one group of people might look very different to another group of people, and
Yeah.
then that's where the nuance comes in, and where you start to develop the personality of the brand around it, and how is it approachable to all these different groups of people.
Mm.
And there's some back and forth, like as you're trying to figure out what it is, you'll get clarity as you talk to different groups of people and interact with individuals. But yeah, I mean, when I do this with technology companies, in my experience, I've had companies completely change their go-to-market strategy. They upended their business and said, "We've been targeting this group for years, and we realized like the real value is for this group over here." And so they
Mm.
will, with that clarity of mind they got through going through our process, they will completely change their go-to-market. We've had other situations where entire boards got shook up, like people left, and they brought on new people whose values were aligned with the organization. So, if you've never figured this out before and it's complete mud and you have discord and confusion and just, no clarity, when you start to get clarity, you start to see, and other people around the brand and within the brand will start to see that, yes, this is where I want to be, or "Oh, I'm here for very different reasons. Maybe I belong somewhere else." And that's okay. You're
Hmm.
much better off to have a united team that agrees on things rather than a bunch of people in the dark fighting without even realizing it.
Right. Right. That makes a ton of sense. I mean, I could think of organizations that a lot of what I do is I help people clarify
Right.
their less so brand, more so vision, but they're very related. And you do see upheavals. I mean, I've told people before, expect 50% of your people to quit when
Yeah,
you
that's
complete
a good
this.
expectation. Yeah. It's hard sell too. Like when we do a rebrand, we try to set the expectation that you're likely going to see a dip, not a bump in your traffic, your sales, or whatever. But it'll be short lived. You know,
Yeah.
12 months from now, you're going to see the results of this in a positive way. But like you're shaking off the dead weight who are here for the wrong reason, or they don't know why they're there at all. And you got to expect that. There's things you can do to mitigate that. You can kind of build it up as a becoming, a transformation. You can start sending out messaging and trickling out things that change is coming beforehand, and try to signal to the people who want to leave, it's coming, the people who want to stay, or maybe even more importantly, the people who are not involved, maybe I should be. And so
Yeah.
there's stuff you can do to kind of soften the blow, or even some on rare occasions spin it into a positive, where like the big launch is an exciting thing. But more often than not, like if you're poking around with an existing brand, you can expect a little bit of a dip, and that's okay. It's worth it in the long run.
So speaking of existing brands, let's say that I do have a nonprofit, and I like what you're saying, and I want to figure out, I want to improve my brand. What are, like, I don't know, two or three things that I could do maybe next week to help make sure? Because the reason I titled this "Keeping Your Promise" is because when we've talked before, one of the things you said is a brand is a promise.
Yeah.
That at the end of the day, when someone sees a brand and buys into a brand, they're thinking of a result in their head of what's going to happen. And if they don't get that result because the brand is misaligned or the person's misaligned or whatever,
Hmm.
then they're going to be upset. Same with donors to a nonprofit, same with clients to a nonprofit.
Hmm.
A lot of the problem that nonprofits have is they have a lot of clients who uh, want to have them help, but that nonprofit's not in a position to help them, and the branding might have given that impression
Yeah.
that they could. So, like, um, I guess first question: how do I identify problems in my brand? How do I know if there's an issue here? And two, what are some key things I can do to improve my brand next week?
Yeah, the first thing is just unification. I think that square one exercise we do is a great place to start, and that's why we start there, right? And you get all the important stakeholders together, and you make sure that you agree on this. And if you don't agree on this, keep fighting until you do, or somebody leaves, and that's okay, right? Because but back to like the sales and marketing kind of disconnect, which is just it's almost a meme at this point. Like anybody who does this kind of stuff knows that sales and marketing very often don't get along, and that's because marketing is trying to get as many people in the door as possible, and sales are trying to get them to take a real step. And, there's something to be said for getting a lot of people in the door. But if you get 1 million people to your website and not a single one of them buys something, there's something horribly wrong, right? Your
Yeah,
marketing department is not doing your company any favors. And likewise, if sales are just trying to get you to pull the trigger and there's buyer remorse and drop off, that's a problem too. And both of them stem from not understanding what is it this company offers, and how do I communicate that so that the expectation is right and you're getting people who want to be there to take action. So I think that's the first thing, is getting everybody in the room and making sure we're all aligned around the same thing. I think step two is just going out into the communities that you serve on both ends, right? If you have donors and you have patrons, talking to both of them and seeing how they think about these things and where this their opportunity to build community around what it is you offer. And those are the two most important steps. I think from there, once you've done those things, you got to spend some time and probably hire somebody who does this and think deeply about how am I going to talk about this, not just in terms of copywriting and language, but also in terms of visuals. Um, that one's hard to kind of do in a podcast, but like things
sure.
look the way they do for a reason. And we're very visual creatures as well. So if something looks off to us, we're gone. There's distrust, something's up. We're not going to take that step, even though it might be a great connection. It might be a great solution for us. So getting the visuals right is just important as getting the language right.
That makes a lot of sense. So can you talk about the real example of the basic fund? I know you helped them out. Can you talk a little bit about what was their challenge, what you guys did to turn that around?
Yeah. So Basic Fund, that was a great project. They provide non they provide assistance to families. I want to make sure I talk about this correctly. Families who are underserved in the Bay Area in San Francisco, to help their children go to a private school, essentially, to go to a non-public school, let's call it that. And they had been around for a long time. They have a lot of donors and board members who are top of industry. I think the best accolade my company has ever gotten was one of the board members is the CEO emeritus of Chevron. So huge, right? And that's the kind of board members they have, the top of their industries, mega corporations.
Mm.
And it was the best accolade we ever get. We redid their brand, and he said to somebody, I've seen a lot of these over the years, and sometimes they're creative, sometimes they're not, but they rarely have anything to do with business. And this was really good. And that got back to us, and we asked him, can we put that on our website? And he said, sure, which was great. So it's pretty cool. Even though we didn't work for Chevron, we have really meaningful, accolade from the former CEO of Chevron. But what we really wanted to do was their brand at the time, it was old, right? It had been around since the 80s, I think the 80s or 90s, and it looked dated. And you can update your logo without updating your core value proposition. As things move forward in time and trends change, you don't want to look dated. If somebody comes to the website and it looks dated, it's like something's off here. They're not up with the times. They're not going to understand my needs today.
Yeah.
We emotionally just red flag right away. So we wanted to make sure that it was more contemporary looking. It was also an apple on a book, so a really dated kind of a metaphor for the way schools were back in the 1800s. Again, not a great metaphor for all the challenges that schools are facing with AI and the internet, and like all the contemporary problems that schools have. And so we worked closely with their leadership team to understand what they wanted to do. We heard from their board. We did our square one exercise with them, and then there's the same dynamic with the church organization I mentioned earlier, with the people that we're serving and the people that are donors, and where can we with a lot of sensitivity go in and start to build relationship there. And the other issue is San Francisco is such a economically diverse place, a racially diverse place, and we wanted this to be around the kids. That's what everybody agreed on. It was like, we just care about these kids, whether it's the parents of the children or community members who happen to be CEOs of mega corporations that want to give money. We care about the next generation, the future. And we haven't talked about archetypes, but we centered around a caregiver archetype. And that was such a fun and almost unorthodox design achievement in the end. And what made it so special was that we started off with some illustrations of children in some of our early concepts. We did other spins on the apple tree, stuff like that. And as we worked through the visuals, everybody loved the idea of a child as the mascot and the logo for the company, but we couldn't just show a child. It had to be a very ambiguous child that could encompass all the different types of children in the area.
Yep.
Or we could do 8 different logos with 8 different, visually different children to represent the diversity of the population they served. And so we did that, and the website's fun. We didn't do the website, but the people who did a great job. And we worked with them to work in that every time you go to a new page on the website, it's a different child illustration. And so you might not notice it at first because they're all stylized the same way, but eventually you're going to have that aha moment. And it's really impactful. It's really emotionally impactful, and it's memorable. And it's memorable in such a good way that you see like, oh, it's a different kid each time. We're helping a lot of different children. And so the printed material, it's randomized. And ideally, when we can do it, we'll randomize the printing so that everybody gets a slightly different child. Sometimes for corporate events and things like that, for donor events, we'll show a logo that has all 8 illustrations in it. But I mean, it was just such a fun project that, I mean, for me, that's some of the best work we've ever done. It's not the most corporate, not the biggest reach per se, but like for me, it was one of the best things we've ever made. And it spoke to that diversity of the audience they served. It really honed in on the fact that they served children in an impactful way. And so it touched on all these things, and the visuals were really, really important. And yeah, it was pretty good.
Awesome. So, any last thoughts before you go? Thank you so much for coming on to our Friday expert panel. If anybody's got any questions who's listening in, feel free to toss them in the comments and I will highlight them. But any last thoughts, or is there something you can do for the nonprofit community that you want to talk about?
Yeah, as I mentioned, we do some pro bono work every year. We're pretty picky about those because we want to make the most impact we can with the resources that we have. But I'm happy to kind of talk to anybody and point them in the right direction if I can. I think that Square One exercise, I'll give you a link so you can share that.
Okay, awesome.
But that's a really good starting point. You'll have to tweak the language for your company, your organization a little bit, but it's a good place to start. I mean, just closing thoughts. If I can encourage anybody to think about their brand more holistically, that there's 3 pieces. It's the character of the company, the experience that you deliver, and then the branding, right? Separate from the brand is just setting that expectation. Work with somebody who's good at that, and make sure you understand what they're doing and why. It's really easy for a project to start off with on the right track of doing that. And at the end, it comes down to, well, I'm the boss and I really just like this color. Don't do that. You should love your brand. It's a reflection of you, but think about all the other stakeholders, and that's the people that you serve, the people who send you money. They care about this too, and you should really consider their voice and what they want to see and hear. And that's how you build community around a brand.
That makes a lot of sense. All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Joe. For every you who are listening, we do these Friday live streams every Friday at noon Eastern in the Nonprofit Launchpad group. So thanks, guys, and have a great rest of your weekend.
Thanks, Tim. Good to see you.